Adrenal insufficiency can make improvement look boring, and that's the part people miss. Not healed, not cured, just less wrecked, less scared, less fragile by 3 in the afternoon, and that can change everything.
That's the strange thing about it. People hear feeling better, and they picture a clean switch flipping. But with adrenal insufficiency, improvement is often more like the body starting to cooperate in tiny ways, and those tiny ways don't announce themselves. A person might recover a little faster after errands, or stop bracing for every single afternoon crash, or realize they've made it through a morning without feeling like they're negotiating with their own body the whole time. None of that sounds cinematic. It's not supposed to. It's real because it changes what a day costs.
And that cost is the whole story, isn't it? Because if someone only sees the outside, they miss the actual win.
Exactly. With adrenal insufficiency, the outside can stay messy while the inside gets a little less dangerous. The Endocrine Society's patient material describes adrenal insufficiency as a condition where the adrenal glands can't make enough cortisol, and in primary adrenal insufficiency, there can also be aldosterone deficiency, which affects salt and water balance. That means the condition isn't just about fatigue in some vague way. Cortisol and related hormones touch blood pressure, stress response, glucose regulation, sleep-wake patterns, and recovery from physical strain. So improvement doesn't always show up as, "I feel normal now." Sometimes it shows up as the blood pressure dropping less dramatically, mornings feeling less punishing, or the body needing less negotiation just to get through ordinary life. That's a huge difference, even if no one would clap for it.
Which is kind of brutal, because the wins are real, but they're small enough to be easy to dismiss.
And the dismissal happens from inside too. That's what makes it slippery. If you've spent months or years in survival mode, your nervous system learns a very specific grammar. Scan, brace, predict, reduce, survive. Then a bit of stability comes back and the brain doesn't go, "Ah, lovely, recovery." It goes, "What's the catch?" Or it barely notices at all. There's something almost upsetting about that, because someone can be objectively doing better and still feel emotionally suspended in the same emergency. Research on quality of life in adrenal insufficiency keeps finding that patients often still report reduced quality of life, even when they're treated, which is part of why the article's point lands so hard. Treatment can help without creating a dramatic before and after picture. One study in the Journal of Clinical Medicine in 2023 found reduced HRQL in patients with primary adrenal insufficiency, and a US survey study found worse physical scores were associated with things like secondary or glucocorticoid-induced adrenal insufficiency, higher daily hydrocortisone equivalent doses, more comorbidities, and financial burden. So this isn't just a feeling people have. The condition really does leave a long tail.
But wait, if the quality of life stays reduced even with treatment, doesn't that muddy the idea of improvement? Like, are we just dressing up partial relief as progress?
No, I don't think so. I think it actually makes the idea cleaner, weirdly enough. Improvement doesn't have to mean resolution. It can mean the lived texture of the day changes. If someone goes from crashing after every social outing to crashing after only the longer ones, that's not nothing. If mornings stop feeling like a wall and start feeling like a rough patch that can be crossed, that's not cosmetic. The article is careful about that. It keeps separating dramatic recovery from meaningful progress. And I think that matters because people with adrenal insufficiency are often being judged against a fantasy standard: symptom-free, energetic, productive, emotionally steady, all at once. But the medical reality is messier. The Endocrine Society guideline for primary adrenal insufficiency talks about glucocorticoid replacement, mineralocorticoid replacement when needed, and close monitoring for symptoms like lightheadedness, salt craving, blood pressure changes, and swelling. That's management, not magic. So if a person is still having symptoms but fewer severe crashes, more stable mornings, or faster recovery after stress, That's a legitimate shift. It just isn't a fairy tale shift.
The article keeps circling this idea that small improvements don't register while they're happening. That feels important, maybe more important than the symptom list.
It is. Because the mind doesn't count in the moment the way it counts in hindsight. If you think about it, that's true for a lot of chronic illness, but adrenal insufficiency makes it especially stark because the changes are so tied to energy, alertness, and stress tolerance. Someone might not notice they're thinking about symptoms less often until they realize they went through a whole afternoon without checking in on their body every 10 minutes. Or they might notice they can do an errand and still have something left for dinner, which sounds tiny until you remember what it felt like when the errand meant losing the rest of the day. The article names those forms of improvement well: recovering faster after exertion, feeling less physically fragile, having more stable mornings or afternoons, less severe energy crashes, less cognitive fog, more emotional resilience. Those are all modest on paper, but collectively they change the shape of a life.
And yet the body can still feel like it's one bad day away from collapsing.
Yes, that's the tension. And it's not irrational. A person with adrenal insufficiency has good reason to be wary because the condition can be serious, even dangerous, if symptoms worsen or a crisis hits. So the hypervigilance isn't just anxiety out of nowhere, it's learned caution. But over time, that same caution can become a trap. The person may be getting steadier while still living as if every moment is a test. There's a Pulses trial published in 2024 that looked at ultradian hydrocortisone replacement and found changes in neuronal processing, emotional ambiguity, affect, and fatigue in adrenal insufficiency, which is a very technical way of saying hormone timing can affect not just physical energy, but how people process emotion and fatigue. That's fascinating because it supports what patients describe. The shift isn't only mechanical, it's in how safe or unsafe the body feels to live in. And if the brain has learned to expect danger, it can take longer than the body does to believe things are a little better.
I'm hung up on that word safe, because improvement here isn't just less pain, it's less fear.
Exactly. And that might be the most underrated part of the whole article. A lot of people imagine improvement as more output, work more, do more, return to the old pace. But for many people with adrenal insufficiency, the first thing that changes is fear. Not gone, just smaller. Less panic around making plans, less dread about leaving the house, less internal alarm when a day runs longer than expected. That's not trivial. It's a reorganization of the day. The article mentions making plans with less fear of cancellation, returning to hobbies, being more present with family, managing more independence. Those are ordinary life things, which is exactly why they matter. Chronic illness can make ordinary life feel like an achievement, and there's a grief in that. But there's also relief. The weird part is that relief can feel emotionally unfamiliar. A body used to danger doesn't always trust calm. That unfamiliarity can make someone interpret progress as fragility instead of stability.
Still, I don't know. There's a risk in making people feel grateful for scraps. Like, your win is that you got through lunch. That can sound insulting.
I hear that, and I think it's a real risk if the story gets flattened into inspiration. But the article doesn't do that, and I wouldn't either. There's a difference between romanticizing small wins and respecting them because they're the scale at which the illness actually changes. If someone with adrenal insufficiency can get through lunch, run an errand, answer messages, and still have enough reserve to recover that evening, that's not scraps. That's functionality returning in pieces, and pieces matter because they stack. The US survey study I mentioned found associations between worse quality of life and practical burdens like financial strain and difficulty managing the condition. That tells you improvement isn't just about the hormone dose being technically better. It's about what life costs. If the cost drops a little, life becomes more livable. That's the point.
So improvement is partly economic, partly emotional, partly physiological. That's a lot for one word.
It is, and that's why people get confused by it. They expect one signal, one obvious marker. But with adrenal insufficiency, the markers are spread across the whole day. Maybe the morning isn't such a cliff. Maybe the afternoon crash is shorter. Maybe the person can sit through a conversation without feeling like they're fading out of their own face. Maybe they don't need to cancel as often. Maybe they can do one more thing before rest, instead of stopping after the first task. Each of those is small, but the life built from them is very different. And because many people compare themselves to who they were before illness, or to someone else who seems farther along, they miss the fact that a slightly less punishing day is still progress. The article's insistence on non-linearity is important here. Improvement doesn't erase bad days. It just means the bad days are maybe less frequent, less severe, or easier to recover from.
That comparison piece feels nasty, because even inside recovery, people can end up ranking themselves against other patients.
It's awful, and it's so common. People look around and think, why can they do more than me? Or, why am I still struggling if treatment is supposed to work? That can become its own second illness. But adrenal insufficiency is not a competition between people with different bodies, different comorbidities, different medication needs, different types of AI, different life demands. The article does a good job acknowledging that primary, secondary, tertiary, and steroid-induced adrenal insufficiency can look different. Primary disease can involve aldosterone deficiency and electrolyte regulation issues. Secondary and tertiary forms often involve broader HPA axis suppression patterns. Steroid-induced adrenal insufficiency can overlap with that physiology because long-term steroid exposure suppresses the axis. So, two people might both say adrenal insufficiency, but their day-to-day reality can be wildly different. That makes comparison almost meaningless, except as a way to make yourself feel worse.
And yet people still want a clean recovery story.
Because clean recovery is comforting, it gives the mind a ladder. Step 1, step 2, done. But chronic illness rarely behaves that way. The article says improvement can feel like learning a new skill, awkward at first, then more familiar. I think that's one of the strongest metaphors in it, because it shifts the target. Instead of asking, am I back to who I was? The question becomes, am I becoming more skillful at living with this body? That sounds gentler, but it's actually harder in some ways, because it means accepting the reality instead of arguing with it. And there's grief in that. A person may be functioning better and still mourning the body they had before adrenal insufficiency, the spontaneity they used to take for granted, the confidence that came from not needing to think through every plan. Improvement doesn't delete that grief. Sometimes it just makes room for it without letting grief run the whole house.
There's something almost unsettling about improvement arriving while grief is still there.
Yes, because people assume progress should feel like victory. But with chronic illness, progress can feel like a strange overlap, relief and loss at the same time. You might be relieved that you're less wiped out, and sad that it took so much out of you to get here. You might be grateful that you can leave the house more reliably, and angry that leaving the house still requires planning that other people never think about. The emotional burden the article talks about, hypervigilance, identity shifts, self-blame, sits right there beside the practical gains. That's why educational language alone can miss the emotional truth. It's not enough to say cortisol matters. It does. But the body's memory of unpredictability matters too. Sometimes a person's nervous system needs time to catch up with the fact that the last few weeks have been steadier than the last few months.
And if the nervous system doesn't catch up, the person can feel broken, even when they're improving.
That's exactly the trap. They start to think, if I still feel cautious, then maybe I'm not really better. but caution can lag behind improvement by months, maybe longer. That's why the article's emphasis on looking back instead of looking only at the day in front of you is so practical. A person may not feel better every single day, but over months they may see fewer severe crashes, faster recovery, more stable routines, less constant symptom monitoring. Those are real signals, and they're often more honest than intensity in the moment, because intensity is noisy. Hindsight is where pattern becomes visible. There's a real skill in noticing that pattern without immediately asking for proof that all symptoms are gone. Not gone, just less commanding.
What do you do with that, though, if you're the person living it? Because knowing this intellectually doesn't automatically make it easier.
No, it doesn't. And that's one of the hardest things. The article's practical section gets close to something useful. Track different markers, not just productivity, not just whether you pushed through. Track emotional steadiness. Track recovery time. Track how often you're cancelled by your own body. Track whether ordinary tasks feel less like climbing a hill in wet clothes. That kind of record can interrupt the brain's habit of only seeing what's still hard. It also gives language to improvements that are easy to overlook. A person might say, "I'm not better," but then admit they're less afraid to make plans, or they can tolerate a fuller day, or they can sit through a stressful conversation without spiraling as hard. That's not nothing. That's the texture of life changing.
I want to push on one thing. If a person's still living with symptoms, is it misleading to call that improvement at all?
I don't think so. But it depends on what improvement is being compared against. If the comparison is to perfection, then almost nothing counts. If the comparison is to the person's own recent baseline, then yes, absolutely. Improvement can be partial. It can be uneven. It can coexist with ongoing symptoms. The article is explicit about that. And honestly, I think that's more humane than pretending otherwise. For adrenal insufficiency, better may mean steadier mornings, shorter recovery, fewer severe episodes, more confidence, less fear, a little more room for relationships or hobbies. That's still better. It just doesn't fit the fantasy of cure. And for many people, especially those with chronic conditions, the fantasy of cure becomes a way to invalidate any reality that isn't total restoration. That's a cruel standard. It makes people feel like they're failing recovery when they're actually building a livable version of life.
So the article is really arguing for a different definition of recovery.
Yes, but not a soft one, a more exact one. Recovery as steadiness, not spectacle. Recovery as more predictability, not perfection. Recovery as a nervous system that isn't constantly braced, even if it still flinches sometimes. And that's where the piece gets emotionally intelligent, because it understands that improvement can feel unfamiliar, even suspicious, after long survival. It gives permission for that weirdness. It says, in effect, if things feel a little better and you don't know how to trust that yet, that doesn't mean nothing is happening. It means your body and mind are adjusting at different speeds. That's a very different message from the usual one people hear, which is either dramatic before and after or personal failure.
That's the trap, either miracle or failure.
Exactly. And the article refuses that trap. It makes room for the middle, where most real lives are. A person can be improving and still symptomatic. They can be grieving and relieved. They can be functioning better and still cautious. They can be less afraid and not yet confident. That middle is where most of the truth lives. And if you've ever watched someone with adrenal insufficiency describe feeling a bit more like myself without being able to say exactly why, that's what they're pointing to. Not a fireworks moment, a shift in load. The day weighs a little less.
That's a better test than symptom-free.
It is. Symptom-free can become a mirage. Less weight, more predictability, a little less fear inside ordinary routines. That's something a person can actually live inside. And it honors the reality that adrenal insufficiency touches so many systems at once. Cortisol isn't a mood accessory, it's part of the machinery that helps the body meet the day. So when treatment and self-management help, the change might appear first in those tiny logistical places, getting out of bed a little easier, tolerating an appointment, not collapsing after a grocery run, feeling more emotionally present with someone you love. That's the kind of improvement the article is naming: quiet, easy to miss, deeply important.
And maybe the hardest part is believing it counts while it's happening.
Yes, because the culture teaches people to trust only the dramatic thing, the obvious thing, the thing that can be posted and proven. But chronic illness often improves in the margins: a steadier afternoon, a shorter recovery, one less cancelled plan, less dread, more room. Those are not small if you've been living without them. Evelyn's piece gets that right. The point isn't to make improvement sound pretty. It's to notice what livability actually feels like when it starts returning, one quiet notch at a time. If this conversation resonated, send it to someone who's been waiting for recovery to look bigger than it does. And if it felt familiar, share it with someone who understands what it means when better is still complicated.